Hello, good evening. I will be your designated Islamic fundamentalist for this evening's debate. Today's debate is on whether terrorism committed by Muslims is caused by Western policy as a main factor, not as the only factor, but at least as a main factor or the main factor. And the question is and we have to look at, did all these horrendous terrorists wake up one day and say, right, let me look on the map, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, the West, we'll target you. How many terror attacks have happened in South America by Muslims targeting South American civilians who are majority non-Muslim? What about South Africa? What about Switzerland? What about Ireland? They're neutral as well. Good old Irish. So, why not them? There is, I believe it was Suriname, 17% population Muslim. There's a greater population of Muslims there percentage-wise than France and England combined, yet no Islamophobia, no tensions, no killings, shootings and violence and so on and so forth. We have to ask ourselves these questions. Why aren't they getting attacked? Now, Islam fundamentally rejects terrorism under any circumstance, under any situation, cause or justification. In Islam, we believe that the rules are absolute, and you cannot breach these rules, even if you think there is some benefit. But if we are trying to understand who's to blame for terrorism, we have to see the first cause, and let's go back to that first domino and see where it all started. And what will help you decide as to who is to blame is that if this first unjust action, and it must be an unjust action, not a good action that went wrong, but an unjust action, if this action had not happened, would we get the situation we have now in the Middle East? So let's have a look. Our opponents today seem to be claiming that terrorism happens against the West amongst Muslims themselves would have happened anyway. They're just innocent bystanders at best, or accident-prone interlopers at worst. The overwhelming evidence shows that this is false. The Ottoman Caliphate wasn't a utopia by any means, but it did exemplify a lot of Islamic principles with dealing with non-Muslims and Muslims of different sects. The office of the Patriarch or the Pope of the Eastern Orthodox Church was financed and supported by the Ottomans. Christians, Yazidis, Jews were given their own semi-autonomous regions to freely move in and out of, to administer as they saw fit according to their culture, with their own law courts and even police forces. In West Africa, the Sokoto Caliphate and the Bornu Sultanate likewise existed relatively peacefully with Christians and pagans, and animalists. The British Empire violently conquered the Sokoto Caliphate and Bornu Sultanate, dismantling their power and building missionary schools to civilize the natives. And this developed a grudge against Western education and the newly created pro-British client state Nigeria. The repressive state measures against a number of non-violent Islamic groups led inevitably to a rise of increasing radicalization, which initially affected both a mixed Sufi and Salafi congregation. And this ultimately arose with Boko Haram, which itself means Western education is forbidden. So it's very specifically, it titled itself Against the West. The British and the French empires violently conquered the Ottoman Caliphate and dismantled them into arbitrary borders and much hated client states. In 1920, Arab Sunnis, Shias and Kurds united together to rise up against the British imperial forces, and their villages were aerial bombed until they submitted. So their civilians were being bombed until they had to submit, which they had to. The British have invaded and aerial bombed Iraq 5 times in the last 100 years, not including last year. Britain and the US have entered Iraq so many times they should probably have a reward card. The German newspaper Der Spiegel recently confirmed that ISIS was set up by former secular Ba'athist Party individuals and with a veneer of religion to give themselves legitimacy in a region where every discourse must have some religious legitimacy. And that their war on the Shias wasn't a religious war, since Iraq hasn't known a Sunni-Shia conflict for centuries, but rather they viewed the Shias as collaborators with the Americans, and they fought against them. And this, obviously, the Ba'athists are horrific individuals, but they were a secular party. The Muslim terrorists are not motivated by Islamic ideology. You've already heard the former British ambassador saying this, but let's see what the terrorists say themselves and what the intelligence agencies say. Osama bin Laden was asked by Al Jazeera why he advocates that civilians are targeted in a war against the West. Osama said, yes, the Prophet forbade the Prophet forbade in authentic Islamic texts that to kill women and children. He forbade this. But the law's not set in stone, he says. He also says that the Quran says you should fight them as they fight you, which he says gives him license to imitate the West in military tactics. He cites Hiroshima and Churchill's bombing of German civilians in World War II as his model, not the Prophet Muhammad. He also said that terrorism was a logical response to Western occupation and propping up of pro-Western client regimes. The problem with Osama bin Laden is he's not a fundamentalist. He's a modernist who cites the West as his model of imitation. He was trained by the CIA to be an insurgent against an occupational power in Afghanistan. After that war, he realized there was just another power he had to fight, as well as the Soviets, who were also occupying Muslim lands. Yes?
I'm fascinated. When did this CIA training of Osama bin Laden take place? I've heard of the conspiracy theory, but there's no evidence at all that bin Laden had any training from the CIA.
Right, so the CIA just basically flood the Afghan Mujahideen with guns. He's portrayed as their leader, and they have no connection. Right, fine. Anyway, Eliza Manningham-Buller, former head of MI5, said, our involvement in Iraq, for want of a better word, radicalized a whole generation of young people and spurred some British Muslims to turn to terror. Arizona State University analyzed 2,000 extremist texts to determine what motivates the extremists. Between 1988 and 2011, it concluded that terrorists were not aiming to destroy Western civilization, but perceived themselves as fighting a defensive war. And they said, we conclude that verses extremists cite from the Quran do not suggest an aggressive, offensive foe seeking domination and conquest of unbelievers, as is commonly assumed. Instead, they deal with themes of victimization, dishonor, and retribution. Former head of CIA bin Laden's unit, Michael Schur, also confirmed the same. It's good to see the members of the opposition continuing the time-honored tradition of depicting all the barbarian and native hordes that have ever fought against the British Empire, who do not do so because we're on their land. But no, it's because they must be a bunch of uncivilized savages who know nothing other than hate. But I admire the opposition. They are so strongly convicted. They won't let small things like first-hand explanations by terrorists, CIA, MI5 experts, multitudes of extremism academics, history, facts, and evidence get in the way of a good ideologically motivated prejudice. In conclusion, terrorism is conducted due to grievances felt by an identity group who feel they're being attacked, treated unjustly, or oppressed. It doesn't matter if the identity is black, white, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Irish, socialist, female, like the suffragettes, and so on. All can be and have triggered acts of terrorism and violence in the name of identity solidarity. In the case of Islam, religious justification is no more than an afterthought used to reinforce the moral high ground amongst a conservative social context. As Osama bin Laden himself admitted, basically there is no Islamic law or interpretation that justifies terrorism. There is only the terrorist's justification of imitation of his oppressors. Not only do they copy the West, but are the manifestation of an equal and opposite reaction to 2 centuries of unjust military and political actions by the West. So it is clear that the cause that explains extremism is not an interpretation of Islamic law, but unfortunately a manifestation of Newton's third law. Thank you.